I have the great pleasure of welcoming Dagmar Soennecken, professor at York University, to this interview series. And Dagmar Soennecken has specialized in a field which looks at the intersection between law, society, and public policy making. And in this context, she has worked a lot on issues of how refugees are being selected, how they're being resettled, and how they're being integrated into society. And one of the key conceptual entry points for Dagmar Soennecken's work has been to think about vulnerabilities, reflecting the needs of refugees and how they are being addressed in a system that works with legal categories and forms of selection processes in identifying those who are then subject to being resettled. So with this, I would like to start off our conversation asking you about what brought you to this particular lens at looking at refugees, at the processes of selecting, recruiting, and then resettling them, and what we see in an environment at the moment where these vulnerabilities have grown. More and more people are in dire need of protection, but with very limited capacity and political will to respond to those needs. Over to you, Dagmar.
First of all, on a very practical level, the thinking about vulnerability started among a group of scholars that were able to get funding from the European Union through the Horizon 2020 grant project. And that is one of the exciting research projects that really allows a large group of people to work collaboratively and look and gain comparative insights. And it's also one of the few grants that allows Canadians to participate. So we really had a broad group of people, also a Lebanese team participating. And the main focus was the concept of vulnerability. And it was driven by the motivation of understanding why the term seems to be so hip and so new in international law and policy making. And as we can talk about in a few minutes, it's really a controversial term as well, because many advocates of refugees don't like that term because they think it's stereotyping refugees and people seeking protection in general as people who are just victims. And there's only certain types of people that we think of when we think of vulnerable refugees. And that's, of course, something that is a problem. But at the same time, it seems to be a practical tool that policymakers and also lawyers at the international level and also at the national level are increasingly drawn towards, because it is politically a salient tool, because you can overcome some of the obstacles in the population, some of the hesitancy, by playing the game of pitching certain people as being more deserving of protection. So that's, I think, important to say at the outset, that there is a drive and an expansion about the use of the term in law and also in policymaking, but it comes with a lot of controversy and baggage. And that's what the project really wanted to dig into.
Could you lead us a bit into this controversy? Because at face value, it looks like a category that responds to the needs and, probably also the policy challenges in this field.
If you think about the term refugee, so somebody who is seeking international protection because they're being persecuted and because they fear for their lives, they might be running away from a war zone, they might be fleeing gender-based violence. There is a range, of course, of issues of why people seek international protection. And then some people make their own way out of that country where the conflict or the persecution is occurring, and other people don't make it to the global north. And we were talking about resettlement, so we have to get back to that definition. But the controversy really is that everybody, one could argue, who is fleeing persecution is vulnerable, because that's a terrible situation. If you are being forced in most circumstances to leave home or leave the place that you've made your home, and you don't have a choice about it because you might be killed, you might be tortured. So anybody in those circumstances is vulnerable to start with. And then to pick and choose, and what my Norwegian colleague, Erlend Pasha, has called to be cherry picking as a government for humanitarian reasons, is, some people think, highly problematic, because there is also a right in international law to seek protection from persecution, but that right only gets triggered if you are crossing the border or the territory of a state that needs to grant you protection under the Geneva Convention. So the controversy is, I think, because we're already dealing with a population that is at risk, and then some people we could argue at more at risk than others, and there are reasons why they should be at the front of the line, but there's a fundamental justice argument there too.
And you've worked a lot also in comparative dimensions, looking at how states have responded to this. How well prepared is, let's say, the Canadian system or the German refugee system with respect to those vulnerabilities? Have you seen, this selection process informing practices on the ground and policies? And where do you see our deficiencies or limitations in this system, and what could we do to improve it if we really want to think along those lines of vulnerabilities and the risks they involve?
I think policymakers struggle with that less so than politicians, and struggling with that is, I think, already kind of I'm trying to be neutral in describing it, because I think policymakers, they need to always work with categories. And we interviewed bureaucrats, we interviewed lawyers, we interviewed people at civil society organizations that assist in the integration and in the resettlement process. And in the Canadian context, they're also involved in helping with private community sponsorships. And I think for them, it's normal that they have to decide who gets to come. And I'm putting it that way because really, if you are still dealing with a population overseas, and that really is, it's only 1% of people internationally who get chosen directly from overseas to come to one of the few countries that participate in this resettlement process. So they know and they deal with the criteria, and they then often have connections with families, and they say, yes, this family is in immediate danger because the father comes from, I don't know, community X and has been a translator in Afghanistan, to pick one of those well-known examples that I think Canadians and Germans are very familiar with. And their families currently in Pakistan in hiding somewhere, and they might have gotten expelled because Pakistan does not respect the Geneva Convention. So you understand, I think, when you have the connection at the community level, but also at the government level, they see those cases and they know, well, of course, right away, this person needs to be moved to Canada as soon as possible just to get them out of danger. So I think the problem there then is that decision makers then have talked to us about this and said, well, of course they're vulnerable. I can see that they are. And then we were saying, but what are your criteria? What are you using? And UNHCR has a toolkit. They have a screening guideline kit that many countries use, but that's of course also a constructed toolkit, and the criteria have shifted around. In some countries, the Norwegian colleagues were saying, well, we've taken a lot of young people because young people really need more care and guidance. But at the same time, we want the young people to also fit within Norway so that they're not a burden on the system, that they can be integrated right away. But there's a lot of care and a lot of resources, obviously, also that communities spend. So in terms of what can be done better is that we've heard a lot of the communication between the needs of the people on the ground that are waiting to come to a safe place, and then how communities are able to resettle and what their needs are. So there's a simple thing that the Canadian government has been working on. That's just information flow. And I was in a meeting with government officials and civil society organizations where the government officials said, we're finally able to tell the community organization that's doing the resettlement what these people's needs are in more detail, because there are privacy concerns, there's time involved, and it's really a process also. It's also about how you do healthcare screening, for example, or care screening for people who might be traumatized or who might have needs. And it's really also that, well, when are we going to do this? People might find it invasive as well. So it's really, I think, a very delicate process. So I think that is really governments and UNHCR also working more closely together. And I think that behind the scenes can run more smoothly, but it's also because governments are around the world picking and choosing because it makes them look good, right? Because we can promote certain groups over others, but it's still a drop on the hot stone or a drop in the bucket, really. So politically, it's very interesting to promote those communities and say, yes, we're doing something, but the pushback by society, because it's also very resource intensive, right? And that's also part of the struggle.
And do you see that these considerations are being picked up at, the international level, the Global Compact, for example? Have we made progress in fine-tuning the system, make it more effective and appropriate to respond to crises? Do you see progress on this front that, let's say the UN system has been improved along those lines? You speak about the communication between the UN system and national ones, in Canada and Germany. I'm just wondering, it is very much a global phenomenon and challenge that we have with all these people in need of protection and refuge. And, have we moved in a way the needle on a system that is more appropriately reflective of and responsive to these needs?
I think it's really small steps, because there is also the other movement that you alluded to at the beginning, and that is really the pushback. And I think especially some communities in Germany, and that also came out in the interviews and the research projects, are really overwhelmed because they're dealing with the influx of Ukrainians. And then that is a totally different conversation from the regular quote unquote flow of people who are seeking protection because there's yet another conflict around the world. But that still at the community, at the local level, was really what some of the interviewees also in the Italian team were saying was really a stress on the resources of the local communities, because they're opening yet another shelter. And that's also where communities are pushing back and saying, we cannot, without more resources, take more people in. And then people don't understand sometimes also the differences and really why people can't immediately start and go back to work, or why they might not speak the language, and why they need a certain safety net and really certain services so that they can then contribute to society, because nobody wants to stay at home and not do anything. And particular people with trauma and healthcare needs, they really also want to make a difference, but it just takes a certain amount of time. And I think it's always politically expedient to say people are coming to be a drain, and so many people are coming because there are so many, jobs available, and all the stereotypes, because times are insecure and people are worried, I think, because the global economy is changing and they don't know where their jobs are coming from anymore. And then people get, I think, just also not educated enough about why some people might want to come to Canada, Italy, Germany. And I think we have a lot of work to do as educators, and politicians, I think, are just seeing the next election. And sometimes it's just too expedient to play to the insecurities of people and not to be generous. And I think we all have the capacity to do that individually, but I think governments always have space for that. But I think it's very difficult because people are anxious, and it only, I think, works at the local and community level to really also take down some of the barriers of prejudice and racism against people who are coming into the community. So that's, I think, where some of the progress can be made.
And you work primarily with decision makers, policymakers, in the system, looking at how they operate. And I'm just wondering, what you describe as a broader political context, right? They're clearly policymakers also, or decision makers in ministries, and those taking very concrete decisions about the fate of individuals coming or not coming. They probably reflect also this kind of political environment, which has become more hostile, right? I'm just wondering whether you're interviewing and working with these people, do you see these anxieties that we have in society also influencing the work of those who should, be, objective and, effective in the decision makers, as policy in the policy community? Do you feel this tension that it has entered also the conversation of those who are in the trenches, so to speak, and make day-to-day decisions?
Yes, definitely. And it reminds me of your last question, which was about the international level. I think decision makers are happy if there are other normative tools that they can draw on, but there is a big tension because they, of course, feel the pressure to meet their target numbers. If the target numbers are reduced or resources are reduced, then they have to still, the Canadian government has certain quotas that decision makers have to make. And sometimes the quota is met early on in the month. And then if your application comes in later on in the month, then you might just get a no because the quota has already been filled. And that is highly frustrating because that's quite arbitrary. And that I think is something that I, for example, didn't know about. So I think there's so much going on behind the scenes where the pressure is vulnerability gets bureaucratized. And in the European context in particular, when we were presenting our report to the European Commission, that was the time when the EU was contemplating moving out all the screenings of vulnerability to the borders of the EU. And they were going to be then using the vulnerability criteria again as a toolkit, but at the borders of the EU where people are really concerned, and bureaucrats and decision makers don't like that very much either, because that's what's the new process going to look like. And is it really a deterrent? Because that's also what politicians really want. They want only the people who really deserve protection to come, but we don't know that and what's going to happen in the meantime. And that's, of course, also the conversation in the United States about the Biden administration's decision to make people wait in Mexico and to only have a quota of people who can apply for refugee protection in the United States, or have this online app that people had to go on to. It's the management of protection, but also the management of vulnerability, and trying to really use, I don't know, some ugly mechanism of survival of the fittest, of who can survive waiting in Mexico or waiting in one of those camps in the EU, right? And that's where you get back to the term of vulnerability, because that's where often more people are at risk and stuff happens in the waiting areas, and then you just compound a worse situation. And I think that is really something that we've really gotten numb to, I think, at the political level. Yet at the same time, there is the what are we going to do? And that, I think, that frustration is, I think, very noticeable with bureaucrats and the lawyers also that we spoke with as well.
And, there's a prominent example at the moment in Albania where Italy had hoped, right, to, in a way, send those coming irregularly via the Mediterranean. And then you see this tension, that the lawyers and the judges now say, no, there is a fundamental right to asylum, and you would need to do this on Italian soil. So, it is, we're going through a phase in which this very mechanism is being rethought, but it has some real risks involved for those, whose claims are being looked at. And, it reflects political desires and political concerns, right, about, access to asylum. I think we see them play out very forcefully in the European context, but, with the new Trump presidency, probably we will see this also in the United States, in a very strong way. Sorry, that wasn't really a question, but, just, underlining these tensions that we have between policymaking, legal protection, and then the political realities on the ground.
And the economic consequences, right? Because I think there's so much money being spent in the wrong ways. And the Trump context is an obvious one, because people that are potentially on the list of being deported are people who are working in the United States, most likely, and contributing to keeping the price of, I was just reading an article, keeping the price of vegetables low, and working very dangerous jobs, and probably being very law-abiding American residents, because they want to make a life and they are dedicated to wanting to make a contribution. They pay taxes, they pay into social security systems that they cannot access. And that's what's the irony, I think, about people who really want to be in the countries that are then trying to get rid of them, because that's also the image of in immigration societies, people that want to be there, and they have worked so hard, they've risked their lives to want to seek protection, but also to build a new life. And I think that's fundamentally that I find frustrating is if people are dying to get into your country, then they don't want to come there to drain your resources. They really also want to make a new life there and make a difference. And I think for me, that's where vulnerability and justice are just so connected, because really that's a fundamental human right for me to have a space where you have safety and where you can raise your family, where you can build your life. And I think I understand that people are saying, but don't do it here with me. That's something else we could debate. But I think creating more legal pathways and creating choices and respecting that people should have those choices, and that people bring skills to the table. In many cases, they're already making contributions, and that I think should be acknowledged, because I think we would benefit from that.
And you added another dimension to vulnerabilities. Those of the receiving countries, if they now close their doors and even deport, those irregular migrants, those who are deemed not appropriate in the country, there are socioeconomic costs and vulnerabilities involved here, different dimension of vulnerabilities, but that we might see play out soon in the US in particular. Thank you very much, Dagmar Soennecken. That was fascinating to hear how also legal categories, that we think are defined, according to clear guidelines, also subject to political pressure and political interpretation, and particularly how a concept like vulnerabilities, right, reflects, both, the legally defined needs of those people seeking refuge and protection, but also the norms projected onto them by those countries who were asked to provide this kind of protection, and how this plays out between legal entitlements and political norms and concerns in the public arena. So I'd like to thank you for this insight, and I hope you will hear more about your research, in times in which this very issue has become top of the political agenda, it seems. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Can I say one more thing? It was really interesting that at the end of our project, that we found out that the Canadian government's Immigration and Refugee Board, they have guidelines for vulnerable persons, and they revised the guidelines, and they were actively citing some of our research. So I think our project is very grateful that the Canadian government at least is talking to and listening to also the work of academics, because that's, I think, also in the times that we're in, it's so important to make sure that there are connections between academics and decision makers, so that evidence-based decision making can continue to happen, because it is complicated. And I think academics make a contribution to helping and offering suggestions and advice. And I think that's also what you were trying to do with podcasts and recordings like this. So I think that's really to be continued, I hope. And thank you for inviting me.